Thank you, Professor Sinha, for inviting me to share with you the findings from the first survey. Now, this is a survey, perhaps the first survey which has been done to capture internationalization or international engagement within Indian higher education institution. To give you a brief context of the study, Shalini from CI and I had a conversation sometime earlier this year about international engagement, and that followed on, and we conducted an online study with Indian higher education institutions. We sent out the online study, followed it up with a fair number of emails to get responses, and this went down to the office of the VC, and the responses were not necessarily as optimistic as we would have liked to, but nonetheless it gives us some valuable insight. So what I'll attempt to do in the next few minutes is just present, if I may, in about 4 slides, the main findings from the study. The details, I won't go into the details. The details are available in the report, which some of you may have seen outside, or it's in the pack, which is about trends in internationalization in higher education. So let's try and see what was the aims of the study. So we wanted to look at the perceived benefits of internationalization, external, internal drivers, external, internal barriers, activities pursued as part of internationalization, what structures and systems are in place, and is there any overseas presence from these Indian institutions? Bear in mind the study was sent out to Indian institutions, higher education institutions. So these were spread over 6 questions with several possible alternative statements, and respondents were asked to select 3 from them, so what they felt was most significant and best reflected their position. And additionally, there were 10 questions which elicited responses to infrastructural support and policy issues. Now, as I said, the response rate was not as encouraging as we would like to have. We had only 20 responses. Now that might be something which we take forward for next year or the next study as to how to make it more sort of participative. But what was the sort of if I may use the word silver lining was that we had participation from all regions. So we had universities from Northeast, South and West. We had participants are across all sectors: national universities, private universities, deemed universities, state universities. So we have participants as old as, say, Aligarh Muslim University, as well as participants as your university chair who have also completed the survey. So let me just share with you the key findings. So the first set of findings, in no order of importance, we looked at institutional policy, strategy and infrastructural support. So the first thing we got from these participants was that all institutions have some form of international partnership. Now, what that international partnership is, we will try and look at that. 75% have a dedicated international office. 45% have internationalization embedded in their overall activity. That's probably why they had responded to the survey in the first instance. So the others probably, when it went to the VC's office, it is probably still lying around somewhere where they were not quite sure. So those are issues probably we would need to address if we do a study again, which we hope to. 10% have some overseas presence. Now, of a participant group of 20, 10% is okay. It's not a, but there is overseas presence, and we know Joanna alluded to in her discussion about Indian universities having an overseas presence, and those of you sitting over here would probably be aware of the universities that are overseas. And 45% institutions, the strategic responsibility sat in the VC's office. Now, you might say, what about the other 62%? But okay, I mean, this is a figure. And this is the interesting bit, which is 90% of it was on staff and student exchange. So when they said they had an international partnership or they have international dedicated international office, that's what I think it alludes to. Moving on, what are the key benefits and risks? The first one is an interesting one. I mean, coming from where I am, from a UK educational system, and some of you, I think, Professor, you alluded to saying about revenue generation. But for the 20 Indian institutes, or for Indian institutions, revenue generation is not a driver for internationalization. There are other factors which drive internationalization, and I think this is a very key point to take note of. In terms of benefit, 65% thought sharing best practice in teaching and learning and developing research links was the main driver. And I think that is to some extent also resonates what's in this particular report, which was released yesterday, Indian Science Ascending, which is the Nature Index. And there, number of Indian universities which come out in terms of collaborative research, etc., come up very high. And that's perhaps what comes from the fact that it's driven by faculty rather than any institutional practices or policy structures in place. In terms of risk, there were two risks which were identified. We thought 80% thought commercialization of higher education is a major risk in terms of internationalization. Although no institution looked at revenue generation as a driving point, I think they also felt that could be an issue. And 70% felt unequal sharing of benefits. As I said, the detail of each finding is in the report, and you will find the distribution. Moving on, key drivers and constraining factors. 90% felt faculty were the internal drivers. So unless we all know, those of us who have some connection with driving internationalization, we know we have to find a champion somewhere, and that's what drives it. And in these cases, it was the faculty. External drivers, this was interesting to me, 75% felt it came from overseas higher education institutions. So it was not an internal thing. So it's those knocking on Indian institutions' doors which drove internationalization. 70% thought it was business and industry demand, going back to the discussion which you perhaps mentioned about employability and global competence. Obstacles, they felt that there was lack of government funding. Now, what is government funding could mean a lot of things. Now, these are things that probably can come out from focus groups and other such ways of finding out. But yes, in terms of that means lack of support, something which a colleague mentioned about NAFSA and ISIS and things like that, those are not non-existent more or less. Difficult in establishing equivalences, and we know if we try to work it out, what is an honors degree, what is not an honors degree, what is 60 credits, what is not 60 credits, and all the rest of it. Those of us who work within the UK system also at times find difficult within our own system to work through. So in overseas system even more. Now, if you take a qualification from India into the UK, you've got an overarching body called NARIC which works with it. In the US, you've got World Education Services which works with it. So again, perhaps there might be something which the government might think about. And 40% thought multiplicity of accrediting and regulatory bodies. We all talk about it. Any higher education gathering probably talks about regulation and accreditation and the multiplicity of bodies. 35% felt internationalization was not a strategic priority. Okay, moving on, we look at, I'll leave it here. I think one of the things we need to look at is that this is a brief study, not an extensive study, but it does throw some valuable insight. Perhaps what is required is to go further into detail, to understand what institutions mean. Obviously, what is also required is to get a much bigger participation rate. If there are 800 higher education institutions, at least if you can get a response rate from about 200, we should be able to make a good analysis. In terms of working out the survey study itself, the instrument, we've learned some things from administering the instrument, where we can change in terms of asking for absolute statements, rankings, and then we can do some correlation, because we haven't tried to do any correlation between one set of statements to the other. There are opportunities there which we can do. And if that's done, I think there'll be a wealth of data which will be available for us to work with. I'll leave you with a small quote from Einstein. So, and in concluding, I think the presence of internationally engaged world-class universities can only help and facilitate and make it enjoyable for the millions of Indian students who are participating, will be participating in higher education in the current decade and the coming years to come. Thank you very much for your time.